who believe
Okay. Party.
you start getting into things like the primordial uh, waters and the sun was a deity all of its own. You know what I mean? Like
Yeah.
there was no god of the sun. The sun itself was a deity.
Yeah. Yeah.
You had the
Yeah.
full.
That's your oldest worship. Yeah. That was actually something that the ancients pointed out. I don't remember who was, probably Plutarch again, was writing about how they worship the gods, but the Persians worship the sun itself or fire itself. They don't call it by anything other than it's just there. They don't have statues. They just look at the sun. Well, they don't look directly at the sun, obviously, except at sunrise and sunset, and even then.
Well,
But
like the Furies in Greek traditions, that would be another example of the primordial. Like the Furies were there before the Titans were there.
mm,
You know, I forgot what they called them, the hyenas,
Humanities?
Uranias or something like
Oh,
that.
Uranians?
Yeah, they had another name.
Oh,
Uh,
Aranyes. Yeah, Aranyes. Yeah. Oh, they're also called the Eumenides, the good ones. You tried to placate them, the nice ones, the good ones, the good neighbors. I wouldn't say a word against them. They're very nice people. They never did me any harm. They're very nice. Hope they go down the street and keep moving.
right.
Um, yeah, well, I think that you've got in a lot of these Indo-European, Indo-Aryan, European mythologies, you've got different sets of gods. You've got the Aesir and the Vanir, or actually it's the Asya and the Vanir up in Scandinavia, and then you've got the Asuras and the Devas in Persia, and then in India you've got the Devas and the Asuras. They wound up on different teams, and of course you've got the Olympian gods of the Greeks. That when the Romans took over Greece, uh, Greek Greece conquered Rome, and a lot of the Roman gods got really realigned into a more Greek pattern. But with the Greeks, you had the so-called Olympian gods. Then you had the non-Olympian gods, but then you also had the Titans, who were kind of like you were talking about, the pre-gods. Um, some of whom continued their function, like Helios, the sun god, even though more people were interested in Apollo, who wasn't technically the sun god but had a lot of solar attributes, or Diana, who was not the moon goddess, that was Luna, or sometimes identified with Persephone, but Diana had a lot of lunar attributes. You had these changes come about with that, getting back to syncretism. That there was these syncretic tendencies between the gods. But then you also had the anti gods, the giants, as they're called sometimes, or the Titans, the bad Titans who rebelled against the Olympians. They were going to pile Mount Pelion upon Mount Ossa to climb up to Olympus and pull down Zeus from his throne, sort of thing. This records that there was a different pantheon of gods, probably related to another people that were met with. There was a struggle, and one people dominated the other. And again, it's interesting because you had in India and Persia, you had the Devas and the Asuras. And in one, the Asuras were the bad guys and the Devas were the good guys, and in one, it was the other way around. And depending on the country you're in, that's how it works, and which is kind of interesting. But I have seen some theories that this idea goes all the way back to the ancient Egyptians, that you'd have like the gods and the anti-gods, but that they existed and actually in some ways worked together in the same universe, because you've got to have plus and minus, you've got to have sun and shade, you've got to have male and female, you've got to have up and down. So you've got to have the constructive spiritual forces, and then you've got the chaotic spiritual forces. And remember, chaos for most people, for most of human history, for most of the time, chaos is not something that you want. Chaos is only fun if you are very wealthy, very comfortable, very secure, and you don't actually get very much of it. Like I say, real chaos is a broken leg. That's real chaos. That's my chaos rant.
It's interesting. I just checked out the thing on the Furies, and you were talking about the kindly ones, or the humanoids.
Yeah.
That means the kindly ones, and then there's another one called the Simni, which is the August ones.
Oh yes, the August. Yes. Always nice compliments. Well, the Irish would do the same thing with the elves. They call them the fair folk. That's why they say fairies, right?
Mm-hmm.
They're the fair ones. They're the good people, the good neighbors, the good people. And that's just what you call them, because you didn't want to make the mistake. You didn't want them to pay attention to you, and if they did, you didn't want them to have bad attention to you. I remember hearing somebody talking once about an anthropologist who was visiting up in the Arctic Circle of all places. And he was talking to the, I guess, Inuit people up there. He was talking to one of the shamans, and he was asking him about, this belief and that belief, and what they believe about this and what they believe about that. And the shaman put up with it for a while. They get used to anthropologists, I guess. So finally he says to the guy, it's not really what we believe that motivates us, it's what we fear. It's what we're scared of. And these spirits aren't fun. Suddenly getting a cramp while you're swimming, you could die. An elf bolt was how they would describe something like what we would today call a stroke, a paralytic stroke.
Right.
Where suddenly, for someone for no reason seems healthy enough, all of a sudden he falls down and he can't move the right side of his body. Well, you offended the fairy folk. The good people were not happy with you. And somebody remembers that he desecrated a sacred space somehow or other. Maybe he plowed across a fairy ring, or did something like that, and that's the result.
I've heard a lot of interesting stories about fairy folk, though. That's kind of what I've actually gotten more interested in the fairy folk now than what I was before, and they really get in depth about things that happen to people who made claims that they went into these rings. Like there are people who supposedly disappeared in history that have reappeared again and died shortly after from like having fevers and things of that nature, and they claim that they went into these fairy circles, and everything that they some of them said that there was like festivals going on, and they had like this overwhelmingly great time, or they were nice to them, and they
Right.
just had a marvelous time. But then when they were able to make it out of the ring, time had passed. A lot of time had passed, and their body couldn't handle the change of how fast time went by. Like,
Right, yeah,
and they would die from that. Like if you went into the actual ring, you had to stay there, or you would come out and die.
Right, yeah, that sucks.
So
that reminds me, there was a very old Irish folk story about a guy who went off with a fairy princess. Well, was a princess to him anyway, but a nice fairy girl. They fell in love, and he went off and he married her, and he went off to live with her on her magic island. And he was there for 100 years or something. And of course, nobody ages there or anything like that. Then he says, I really want to go back and see my old friends in Ireland. And she's like, no, you can't go, And he says, oh, come on, please. She's like, all right, you can go if you must go. Take this horse. Do not get off the horse under any circumstances. So he goes back to Ireland, and he rides right over the sea, because the horse rides up in the air, and he rides right up the beach and onto the land, and he's not even wet. And he sees all these people, and they say, hey, do you remember so-and-so? It's like, oh, yeah, he was a great hero, but 100 years ago, when he was just a young man, he went off or something like that. And so he's riding around and talking to people and hearing about his own legend. And he sees these men trying to move a boulder. Says, I can help. Without even thinking, he jumps off the horse. The minute he touches the ground, he's 127 years old. Boom. And just keels right over like Rip Van Winkle.
Yep.
But, one of the interesting things about these stories, and this is something that Jacques Vallée pointed out. He wrote a wonderful book called Passport to Magonia, which you would enjoy, Roger, and anyone else listening would too. And Jacques Vallée pointed out that when you have these stories of people going into like fairyland, they go into the fairy ring, or they go into an elf mound, or they're carried off to an island, and then they come back and like all this time has passed. A lot of these stories, and I'm sure you've read them, where somebody comes back from fairyland and it's like, wow, my house is gone. Where is everyone? And they ask about people. They ask about their parents. Oh, those there, they died 100 years ago, and they had a kid that just disappeared, and nobody ever saw him again. But that was way before my time. And he finds the oldest guy who barely remembers it, stuff like that. That's something that we didn't have a modern concept of until Albert Einstein. That is time dilation. They're describing an actual physical thing, the so-called twin paradox, where if you have twins who are, on the Earth, and one becomes an astronaut or a cosmonaut, depending on what country you're in, and he goes on a spaceship that can go near to the speed of light, he will travel out at near the speed of light and return, and for him, time will slow. So that while the twin on Earth, 20 or 30 or 50 years pass, for the twin in the spaceship, maybe only a few years, 1 or 2 years has passed. So when he comes back, he steps off the spaceship and everybody is 50 years older. And he has no idea, because he knows, and according to Einstein, that time did not pass for him. But also, that time did pass, those 50 years did pass for the twin, right? Nobody had any idea about this at all until Albert Einstein, except for the people that came back from fairyland and found everything had aged 50 or 100 years. So that's an interesting indication that these folk tales might be hiding a real experience that was simply felt to be beyond the bounds of anything even vaguely possible. Most people for most of history would hear that and say, that's just nonsense. Now we know that there's actually ways you could do that. Another way would be if you had a sufficiently strong gravitational force. Again, I'm going with Einsteinian physics. We won't argue whether Einstein was right or not. That's a whole show in itself. But if, according to Einstein, if you have a sufficient mass, that will also slow down time. The classic example is the so-called singularity, or black hole, so-called, which, again, I personally don't believe in the actual physical existence of black holes. However, I do think the math is good enough to show that with sufficient gravitational force, it doesn't have to be all the way down to a singularity level. Hell, a neutron star. If you had like neutron star matter, I'm not sure how much you would need, but I'm sure you could warp time as well as space around it and probably get similar effects. So could these be people who were brought near to, I don't know, if I'm a science fiction writer, I could say maybe there was an alien or ultra-terrestrial, ultra-dimensional spacecraft that used collapsed matter as a source of energy. So just going into the spacecraft would be enough to slow down time for you. It's possible. The thing is, there was no possible explanation when these stories were first told. Nobody had any idea about this stuff in the Middle Ages. And yet today, again, in a post-Einstein world, we say, oh yeah, time dilation. So it's like a recognizable physical fact. At least it's been proven experimentally, as far as I know. So that indicates there's something going on here, Roger. Something going on a little more than we might think.
Well, I've been saying that for a while, because you know how I get when it comes to Castor and Pollux. I was talking to you about Helen of Troy before, and about the cosmic egg theory. And like when you were talking about these strange things when it comes to twins, like Castor and Pollux and Helen and her sister. They were all twins born at the same time from two separate eggs.
That's right. And as I remember with Castor and Pollux, one of them was mortal and one was immortal.
Same with
The
Helen and
one, yeah,
because
I think,
who was it? Castor and Helen were the ones that were born immortal.
I think so, yeah. Although I think there was a deal where Castor and Pollux would switch days
Yes, yes, that's it.
because they loved each other so much. One of the interesting things I always liked about Castor and Pollux's iconography, even back in the ancient days, was when you saw them, they both wore an eggshell for a helmet. It was their eggs that they'd been born out of, and they wore them as hats. That was kind of interesting. So they were the original eggheads. So if you see a young man on a horse with an egg for a helmet, you know that that's one of the divine twins there.
So when I think about a lot of that, I think about how interesting it is with, like, especially in Greek uh, uh, stories, they always talk about, the cosmic egg, and how a lot of people, or a lot of these deities, or supposed deities, are hatched from eggs. And the egg is actually very, very important. Like the yolk, I believe, is even the yolk of the egg is actually a spiritual thing in Buddhism too, isn't it? The yolk.
Um, Probably. It's not something I'm personally aware of. I never got much into Buddhist eggism. It sounds like a Mahayana kind of thing, though.
It
Wouldn't
probably
be
is.
surprised, though. The egg is like almost universally a symbol of life, potential. And I've always felt the yolk is particularly important. That's why I always get my eggs cooked over light, so I can dip my toast into the yolk. And I often add a little salt and Tabasco sauce to a runny yolk. Nothing like it.
The most interesting thing about Pollux and Castor, though, for me, is St. Elmo's fire.
Yeah,
You
that's
know,
cool.
now that is really an interesting topic. I haven't talked about St. Elmo's fire the whole time that I've been doing this stuff, but I really do love the whole concept behind it.
Well, of course, they would call them the Dioscuri, the heavenly twins. They were famous patrons of sailors, and I think it probably had to do with their constellation showing at a time that was seasonable for sailing, or so they say. Pardon me, but they were traditionally guardians of mariners, and with Christianity, folk religion doesn't really change much, or it does change, but like over time. And sailors, especially, are very deeply superstitious. And on top of that, nobody's going to mess with them much because they want to get their merchandise somewhere. So for sailors, when St. Elmo's fire happens on a ship, and it's usually like the masts and things like that, they would say that was the protection of the heavenly twins, and that meant that they would make it through the storm. And lo and behold, they would make it through the storm. Whenever they saw St. Elmo's fire, and they would get to port, and they would tell everyone, "We saw St. Elmo's fire." Well, they didn't call it then. They would say, "The twins came to us. We saw them on the ship. The ship glowed, and we got safely home to port." And so the story spread that if you saw this, you would get safely home to port. Now, Roger, I'm sure, as a thinking man, you instantly see that there were probably other ships that had St. Elmo's fire that did not make it to port. However, they never reported this fact. So there was this uniform feeling that if you had this, you would make it to port. I hate to burst anyone's bubble about any pagans out there and the efficacy of the divine twins. And I could be wrong because I haven't heard those reports either. But this is just something my postmodern skeptical mind instantly arises up. But but anyway, I'm just saying this is how you can see how this belief would come about. That this was a very lucky thing, because obviously the only people reporting it were very lucky. They got through the bloody storm. It's sort of like having cats on ships. There was an anti-cat backlash at one point in Europe that you can read about with Christianity, especially, but not with sailors. Sailors always loved cats. And again, nobody was going to mess around with these beliefs too much. They were very, very entrenched, and there was no real motivation to change it because you wanted ships to get there, and you're not going to get any sailors on a ship that doesn't, follow this. But the thing about having a cat on a ship is if you went to sea without a cat, the rats could run riot. They could eat the rigging. Suddenly your sails aren't working. With cats, you don't have the rats nibbling your toes at night. Your supplies are unhindered. The ropes don't part suddenly. And very importantly, cats can tell when bad weather's coming. If you're a cat owner, you may notice your cat behaving oddly before a storm or something like that. So they'd have like a little walking barometer. So yeah, a ship with a cat or three on it was a hell of a lot more likely to make it to port. I mean, there's good reason for some superstitions, I guess, is what I'm trying to say. And when Europe became Christian, this level of folk religion, it's like when I've talked about Buddhism coming to different countries where people don't stop believing what they believe, but they believe it through a different kind of a lens. I was talking to Tan about, you might have seen me posting about the that documentary about this small church and the saint in Wales, and I posted another thing about all these disappearing churches. And what's interesting is, you've got all these little saints that pop up.
Mm-hmm.
They call the so-called primitive saints. I call them irregular saints sometimes. They're not canonized by Rome or anything like this, but like people have a church and they have a local hero and he dies defending them, and then there's some miracles, and the next thing you know, people are praying to him, and bam, you've got a saint. It just kind of arises spontaneously. Before they had a Christian framework, that probably would have been a local hero that they would have been sacrificing to and pouring out wine and honeycomb. Instead, they're going and lighting a candle for a statue of him. But it's a spontaneous, from the bottom up kind of a religious expression. These little churches were out in the middle of nowhere. They had little or no contact with Rome. They certainly weren't having like official delegations from the Holy Office coming down to like investigate the claims of or canonization of Saint Cubby or Saint Elmo or whoever. These were just the local saints,
Mm-hmm.
and yeah, I think this sort of religious activity has always happened. So we can always look at this activity. There's been no real change in that, except nowadays with the secularization of everything, so that a lot of people stop going to the churches at all. Although there are signs of that reversing now. These things always have a fashion. You always have like a secular age followed by a religious age, followed by a secular age, followed by, it's like beards.
Mm-hmm.
You have a bearded age, and all those Victorians in the 1850s and 60s and 70s with these beards, monstrous, great beavers. And then you get like the late Victorians and early Edwardian, the younger generation, where they're going to shave. They're not going to be like those old guys. And then the 1960s and 70s hits, it goes the other way. Then it got really shaven again, like in the 80s and early 90s, mid 90s, and then we started going over to beards again in the early 2000s. It goes back and forth, but the people's behavior stays the same pretty much, I think.
Now, I remember when it comes to that, it didn't dawn on me until later on when I was doing research into ancient history, and I when you were talking about the secularism, it blew me away because they were even doing that during the times of Babylonia too. They had a ritual of humiliation.
Huh.
And when people gets into the whole ritual thing, that's when you start seeing where they actually start not really having a true belief in these deities. They just do it as like a ritual because that's what you're supposed to do.
Right.
And with ancient Babylon, that's a good example. Like the king was required to be slapped and forced to cry as a part of a ritual of humiliation. It was during the Akitu, the New Year festival, and I found that interesting that the man who ruled over Babylon had to be slapped by the high priest. and it had to hurt so bad that he had to cry in front of his people. You know.
Well, that's interesting because if you think about it from a Janesian point of view, and I'm an aficionado of the psychological theories of Dr. Julian Jaynes, the Princeton psychologist. I always throw Princeton in there. Who talked about people at that time period having a different set of mental equipment than we do now. And the short version being that what we would today consider to be audiovisual hallucinations were a normal part of human consciousness, so that at times of stress, you would not be introspective. Today we have what we call a ruminative or introspective consciousness. So if we have a problem, I always use the example of I have to cross a river. All right, the river is running really deep right now. So if today, a human today would say, well, geez, I don't think I can cross here very safely. But if I go upstream, someone told me, I remember hearing that there's a ford up there. If I go upstream, I bet I can cross. That's not how it would work. You'd come up to the stream, and according to Jaynes, people kind of lived in an eternal now all the time. They're just like bopping along. They see the stream, but they still think about it, but the way they think about it is different. All the rumination goes on in the right-hand side of the brain, and then the right-hand side of the brain communicates with the left-hand side through an audiovisual hallucination. You will hear a voice.
Mm-hmm.
Perhaps the voice seems to be coming from the river or the sky, or maybe a bird or an animal, or maybe a small idol that is set up nearby for travelers. And the idol would say something like, "Cross ye not here, for ye will drown. Go ye upstream and find there a ford." And you would hear the voice and you would obey the voice. You would just turn and do it. You wouldn't even think about it. It was like being in a state of hypnosis. And if you know anything about hypnosis, hypnosis is basically when you do whatever a voice tells you. We are hardwired to listen to voices and do what they tell us. That is why we turn on the radio and we start listening to a podcast, much like this one, and we hear someone describing something really horrible going on, and this person's really bad, and he's doing this, and we get angry about something we know nothing about, something we hadn't heard of 5 minutes ago, about someone we have no details about, but now we're going to give money to help defend this person, or we're going to give money to fight that other person. And we get all worked up about it, or we decide we're going to march off and have a war or something like that because a voice told us. And we simply click something and we do what voices tell us to do. We're hardwired for it. And this is because there was a time when it was a normal, completely normal way for humans to think, to consider something and then relay it to the rest of the brain with a voice. And there are, and I could go on for an hour about how they've shown with the audiovisual hallucinations that you have in schizophrenics today, they've been able to track electrochemical activity in Broca's area and Wernicke's area of the brain, which are the parts of the brain that handle language and speech, going off in the right-hand side of the brain where they're not normally supposed to do that. It's the left-hand side of the brain. So this lateralization of brain function was a lot more pronounced in the bicameral age. All that being said, now that we've had this very brief discourse, getting back to the ceremony of humiliation, the guy running Babylon, what we think of as the king, was not really the king. That was not his title. He was the overseer of the god, and it was considered that he was just the manager. He was the straw boss. He was the field hand, the chief field hand for the god, and he took his orders from the god or from the priest or priestess or whoever was representing the god. And again, according to Janesian theory, these guys would literally hear a voice coming from the idol. When we read these inscriptions, it wasn't the idol was in the temple. The god was in the temple. This was the god. The god said this. We took the god out and changed its clothes and washed it or whatever. We carried the god in procession. The not really the king, but who we translate as the king, got his instructions from the god. So as the bicameral age broke down, people didn't hear the voices so much anymore, but they relied more and more on the ceremonies. And even if the priest or priestess wasn't actually hearing voices that were coming from the God telling them what to do, well, they're not going to give up their job, right? The same thing with the guy, the overseer of the city. It's like, well, he's not getting direct messages from God anymore, but I think king is a pretty good title I can start using now. And yeah, so the structures stay in place. But again, according to Janesian theory, anyway, the bicameral mind broke down. It was an evolution of our mind brought about in a great part because of writing, which enabled us to remember things differently. So he thought of it as a kind of memory. If the king said, "Go dig in this field," you would literally hear his voice repeated. This was the voice of authority. But later on, you could just have like a clay tablet or a piece of paper. Go do this. You didn't have to always have this voice telling you what to do. And the thing about having a whole society based on people listening to voices, that can work up to a point, as long as everything is very stable, as long as everybody is raised very uniformly. Everybody is basically, I mean, for us, it would be a very insect-like existence. Things would be very, very structured. Things would be very, very regular. There would be a great deal of conformity. Nobody would be different.
Kind of
People
like
who were different would be discouraged. That's where laughter, probably came from, according to James, because if you laugh at someone, it's a non-lethal way to enforce conformity. If, in other words, everybody is supposed to be digging in this field, and then one of the guys hears the wrong voice, tells him to go dig in that field, everybody can turn and laugh at him. He'll see what's going on, and then he'll hopefully hear the right voice or figure out what's going on. You don't have to just kill him. As you find in the Bible, where the man who was gathering sticks on the Sabbath is slain at the orders of Moses, I believe, because he broke the rule. He gathers sticks on the Sabbath. You can't have that. But laughter is a much better way. It kills less of your own people off, if nothing else. So when the king, as we call him, the overseer, is going through this ritual humiliation, it's reminding him and everyone else that he's just the overseer. It is the God city. In a sense, Jerusalem was probably the last eastern city that still had that. You had the temple in Jerusalem, and you had Yahweh in the temple inside of the ark. And I know, the God of everything, and and it's an empty temple and all that. But still, the idea of you've got a temple in the city, and the city is built around the temple, and the God owns the city, and the priests tell the city what to do, and everybody. And that was, every city was like that. That was Marduk's city, that was Enlil's city. This is Jehovah's city. This is this guy's city. So, but again, as the bicameral mind broke down, it's the sort of thing where the second and third ranks in power, again, it's like the old joke about the Pope. It's a great job because the boss never shows up to look at the books. And that was the case with these. All of a sudden, God's not telling them what to do anymore. It's like, do we really need all these priests? Do we really need this temple? And it goes from the temple being the biggest building to the palace of the king becoming the biggest building. And then, of course, later on, we saw that it wasn't the palace of the king so much the biggest building anymore. It became the church, became the biggest building in Europe. And then after that, it became the stock exchanges, and the businesses became the biggest buildings, which are the biggest buildings we have now. I don't know what the next biggest building is going to be, but it'll be interesting to see.
I think it's going to be it's going to be underground more than anything else.
It will, and it'll probably be an AI data center.
Probably. I
think that's going to be our next.
I think our only next logical direction is down into the earth. We're tired of living on the surface of the planet. We're going underground.
It's something Isaac Asimov used to write about. You ever read any of his science fiction stories?
Now, Asimov, I was wanting to do one that he had. He's the one who inspired a lot of scientists, believe it or not. I believe who was it? There was it Newton? I believe it was. No, what's his face? He came up with oh my God, I'm having a brain fart. He's the one that actually he came up with the theory of relativity.
Oh, Einstein, Albert
Einstein.
Einstein.
Wasn't he inspired by Eisenhower?
I don't know. Asimov was a little after Einstein, I think. But I know
Asimov.
Asimov was he was a biochemist actually. I know Arthur C. Clarke, the science fiction writer, got a lot of credit for predicting communication satellites. Um, but Asimov, I'm sure, inspired a lot of people. I'm not sure who you mean offhand.
iRobot.
But
That's what it was. He's the one that.
right, the robotics. Yeah, he inspired a lot of the robotics industry. I wish they would have Asimov's laws of robotics.
Mm-hmm.
Just seemed like a basic thing to include with any of this AI. But I was thinking about his Caves of Steel stories, and he wrote a series of stories about basically a future where we just started digging down, like you're saying. And so people like lived underground all their lives, so they didn't like going to the surface anymore. Like you're saying, they didn't want to go up. And later on in his foundation stories, he had this planet called Trantor, and Trantor was a planet that was turned into one big city. The entire surface of the planet was a building, except for like the Imperial Park where the Emperor lived. He had like 100-acre like park, but everything else was completely covered with metal. And the people there, they just didn't care to go outside. And why would you? You were born in a hospital, you grew up in a corridor, right? You
Mm-hmm.
went to an indoor swimming pool to swim and exercise. All the gymnasiums and tracks. We have indoor football stadiums today, right? So just imagine if every event you've gone to, even the big public ones, were under a roof somewhere. Um, that would be an interesting. I think if when we start setting up moon bases, we're going to have to dig. I mean, it's dumb to build surface installations on the moon any more than you need to between the micrometeorites and the hard vacuum and this and that. You want to dig, you know?
Yeah.
I mean, there's nothing up on the surface for you anyway. Um, we
Especially
make
in
our own
Mars.
light in the air. Yeah, on Mars too. Mars has more possibilities, but there's there were some theories about you could terraform Mars.
That'd be cool,
Um,
but we'd still have to use the resources. We'd have to use their actual soil to make concrete
yeah.
and things like that. So why
Oh
not?
yeah. Yeah.
I would just
Well,
go
that's going to be a
full.
lot of work. You got to figure out what everything is made of, and the engineering problems would be immense. But
The
it'd be kind of
cities would
fun
be
to figure it out.
the cities would be beautiful though, man, because it'd have that pinkish turquoise kind of look to it. Everything would be just like all
Oh,
pink.
and the gravity and atmospheric pressure would be beautiful. I used to have a theory that we're from Mars,
Hmm.
and the reason I had this theory was that because if you look at all the life on Earth, including life that's supposed to be pretty darn intelligent, like elephants and dolphins, things like that, you'll notice something that's different from humans from every other life form on Earth, right? We walk on our hind legs and we
Hmm.
wave our front forelegs around. And in fact, we even develop fingers and stuff so we can manipulate stuff. Okay, this is insane to do on a planet like Earth with this gravity. I don't know about you, man, but my back is killing me. We're not designed for this. The gravity is too great for people to stand upright and not have sore backs all the time. But on Mars, oh, on Mars, no one would have lower back pain. You just wouldn't have it. And another great thing about Mars is somebody pointed this out because of the lower gravity and the lower atmospheric pressure. Your muscle tone would be great.
Oh, that'd be awesome.
No more of this big abdomen sticking out on me anymore. You just stand there. It's like all the muscles would just tighten right up. We'd all have abs of steel. So obviously we're meant to live on Mars.
I
Obviously, we evolved from Mars. Obviously, we're from Mars. This is my entire theory, by the way. It's not backed up by anything else except lower back pain and abdomen. I think it's a pretty good. I mean,
go
some of the
for it.
stuff that guys discuss. I mean, I've got to bring some kind of a crackpot theory to the group, so maybe I'll bring that to the show tomorrow night.
With me, I mean, when it comes to Mars, there's one thing that sticks out to me, and it doesn't necessarily have to do with that planet or this planet, but it has to do with the theory of what is it? Panspermia, I believe.
Pangea?
No,
Oh, panspermia. Yeah, panspermia. Life
panspermia.
everywhere. Yeah,
It's like evolution. Everybody talks about evolution and how we've evolved because of evolution. A lot of people don't realize that since right around the 1990s and the early 2000s, they found out that our evolution is also another big contribution to that was the actual viruses.
Yes.
You know,
Yes.
and that we wouldn't have evolved as the way we have if it wasn't for being introduced to a lot of viruses, and some of them are actually beneficial to human beings. You know,
Yeah.
and that was something that really blew me out of the water when I thought about that. And there's people who actually believe that through panspermia, these viruses were introduced to Earth because of like asteroids and comets that crashed into the planet. And I found that very interesting. You know, so that's something that I've really been wanting to get into. I haven't gotten into it yet, but I really do want to do research into it.
One of the things is, I think, has to do with our sense of time, because, and I mean that they just did a study somewhere saying the things that we've all known just intrinsically, we just know from our experience that time goes at a different rate differently at different times, and also differently for different animals. There are animals, there are insects on this planet that live 24 hours. There are other animals that live on this planet for hundreds of years. Think Galapagos tortoise, right? A couple hundred years is nothing for them. 800-year-old tortoise, 200-year-old parrot, or birds. Everyone has a different time sense. So we look at the heavens and we think about the immutable stars. But if we had a different sense of time, we'd see the galaxy as the spinning pinwheel full of explosions and collisions and pops of flashbulbs going off. Just think of this pinwheel going, with all these sparkles going off. It's a very active universe. And when you think about the idea of panspermia, and like some of the ideas you were talking about, Sir Fred Hoyle wrote a book called The Intelligent Universe, where he talked about the building blocks of life being seeded here, changes taking place through the introduction of viruses, which, as you point out, can be beneficial at times. I mean, just even aside from boosting up your immune system by giving it a workout, he came up with the idea that these viruses also did minute genetic changes that cause the activations of parts of your DNA that they call junk DNA, but which some people think are future genes that will be needed as conditions change on the planet, almost as if there's some sort of a plan. But now this would take billions of years, but that's just to us. On a certain level, billions of years are an eye blink. It's like, just drop this dye on this slide, and watch it like, travel through all the different layers of the onion or whatever it is. To us, that takes a moment. If you were like a being on the level of the onion, it might take, billions of years for this to happen. So yeah, the idea that you could wash a planet with life, wash it with building blocks, wash it with materials that it needs, wash it with instructions from viruses and stuff to change the DNA, and then wash it with things like mushroom spores, which I was having this discussion with someone else not long ago about the fact that I think mushrooms come from outer space. And I think this is so because mushroom spores can survive in outer space, and you don't evolve an ability to do something unless there's a reason to do it. You don't create a spore that can survive hard vacuum, intense radiation, just basically all the, intense cold, all the conditions of deep space, unless there's a reason to do it. And I think I've talked before about how when you look at all the huge variety of mushrooms on this planet and the huge varieties of effects they have on people, everything from culinary, tasty, edible mushrooms through mushrooms that are so-called psychedelic mushrooms that open the mind up to dimensions that would take forever to explore, all the way to mushrooms that are so amazingly deadly. They seem to me that they have to come from another planet. I mean, there are mushrooms you can eat, and you just eat a little bit of one, and like your liver is Swiss cheese within 3 days. What the hell is that? That's not from this planet, man. That is like
Yeah.
some alien toxin. So my theory is that the reason there are all these different mushrooms is because all these different species, you're going to have in a panspermia universe, right? You're going to have intelligent life arising on all these planets, but it's going to be really different in each case. It's all going to be within the parameters of like light and heat and DNA and stuff, but the body chemistry is going to be completely different in each case. So all these different mushrooms are there because for every species in the universe, when those mushrooms get there, one of them at least will be a psychedelic mushroom that will open them up to the next step, which is opening up the mushroom mediated intergalactic mycelium communication network, where you actually start to talk to other beings in other dimensions and worlds through the mushroom, which transcends space and time. So you've got, I'm reinforcing this by an account I read of somebody who ate a culinary white button mushroom and had a psychedelic experience, just because their body chemistry was just right. So my theory was that any mushroom is potentially psychedelic depending on what species you are, what planet you're living on, and what time and dimension you're in. So yeah, that's my mushroom theory.
It's a very interesting mushroom theory. And
I like it.
when you look at that, it reminds me of an episode of Ancient Aliens I seen years ago, and it was actually a good one. It was where this old guy he was I'd like to say biologist. Yeah, biologists are the ones that do the research on the Earth and stuff, right? No, that's a
Geologist.
geologist.
Biologist. Yeah, geologist.
He's a geologist, and he went to South America, or no, the Arctic. He went North Pole, and he wanted to get ice samples up there. And the reason why he wanted to get ice samples up there is because he wanted to prove that panspermia occurred through a comet, I believe it was, because comets have ice that gather on their tails, and he believed that spores came off of the back end of comets, and they're the ones that seeded the Earth with what we determine as life. And he was doing this all of his life, and I guess he was retired now after maybe in his 60s. It looked like he might have been in his 60s or 70s, but he was going up there to get this sample, and while he was there, he found ice worms. Did you know that there's such thing as ice worms?
Yes, I did. I tell people about them, but they don't believe me.
It's amazing.
Ice worms. Yeah, they're not from this planet. That's another alien life form.
And they're very rare too. And a lot of people don't realize that they're very rare. For them to catch an ice worm on national television was a miracle all on its own.
Yeah.
But they did. They found it. And these ice worms, they live within the ice, and they just go burrowing through the ice, and they eat freaking I don't know what you'd call it. It would be cells, membranes, whatever.
Yeah, there's like little organic matter bits that they can eat. Yeah,
See, that was the whole reason why he was there.
But they can't survive above a certain temperature. They just melt. That's like, wow. That's not from this planet.
Yeah, see, I didn't know that.
Yeah, they just melt. They just go. They have to be at a certain temperature. I forget what it is, and if they get above that, they can't survive. They have to be in the cold.
So that makes me even cooler in my book.
I mean, you can look it up, but I'm pretty sure because that was the thing I read about that. I'm like, no. It's like you ever see a pangolin? That's not from this planet. I mean, it's like a snake with legs and hair and scales, and its teeth are in its stomach. I mean, come on, man. That's not from Earth. That slipped into a dimensional doorway or something.
Yeah.
There are these dimensional slipways where these weird animals get in here. I
Yeah.
mean, hell, I think that's where some of those dinosaurs came from. I think they were tourists from another dimension that got stranded here.
Okay, so I found a little bit of information on ice worms. Now, predators for the ice worms are preyed upon primarily by birds, especially alpine species like snow bunting and gray crowning
Ooh,
rosy finches. Now, their diet is snow algae, bacteria, and other microscopic organism matter like pollen that accumulate on glacier surfaces, emerging from the ice at dawn and dusk to feed, helping to recycle, blah, blah, blah. But their lifespan, the lifespan of a typical glacier-dwelling ice worm is estimated to be around 5 to 10 years.
yeah,
Wow,
pretty good
that is
for a
pretty good.
worm.
I
Yeah,
didn't think that at all.
wow. Yeah,
Now they
I
you
figured like a year. Wow, that's good.
mhm. Now they survive freezing temperatures by using specialized antifreeze proteins (AFPs), maintaining
Nice.
maintaining high ATP levels. I don't know what ATP means for
I used
energy.
to know, but I forgot. Yeah, it's an energy thing. I used to know what it meant, but I forgot.
That is cool. I pulled it all up for you because I knew that,
Cool.
that really is an interesting. That's very interesting. Ice worms are probably the coolest things I've talked about so far.
Yeah, just
That
amazing.
like I've completely forgot about the ice worms until we had this conversation. To be honest with you,
I
and
hadn't thought about them in quite a while, but thanks for reminding me.
well, the thing about ice worms that really gets me is like if
Wow.
you look at them in a microscope,
Uh,
they look like horrible, monstrous freaking aliens that can like bite your face off. I,
uh, I think a lot of our monsters come from the insect world.
mhm.
They are really scary when you look at those little critters, wasps and bees and praying mantises and ice worms and annelids.
They had
And
a
they when we think of like dragons, it's really just like a giant serpent. You know.
yeah. Well, I think people are terrified of worms in the first place. Like, I, if you really look at a lot of the scarier older movies, when it comes to like worms, man-eating worms, that's probably one of the scariest movies they came out with. It may not have been a top box office movie, but it was probably one of the scariest ones. I think it came out in the 70s. And
I saw an Ultraman episode from the 1960s. You ever watch Ultraman?
yeah, I watched Ultraman.
Well, there was an Ultraman episode that came out in, I think it was 66 or 67. And it was about they had all the giant monsters, and it was like a giant worm. And it buried itself and was attacking, the science squad there by burrowing under the earth. So you see this huge burrow coming at them. And I thought, that's where Frank Herbert got the idea for Dune.
Probably.
And I looked it up, and that's when he was writing Dune. He was sitting at home watching Ultraman looking for an idea, and he saw that burrowing one. Because you're right, it's scary. You see that thing coming from you, it can swallow your whole spaceship. It's like, ah,
Mm-hmm.
So
Terrifying.
he just, yeah, yeah, it is. Uh-oh, I'm getting a sign. I think we're going to have to get ready for our descent to Shambhala International Airport soon.
Let me grab my
I
seatbelt.
got my sound effects going here. So yeah, I'm afraid I'm going to have to turn on the seatbelt light, turn off the smoking lamp. The stewards will be by to collect your hash bribes, rolling papers, and other paraphernalia. Please return your seat to an upright position as we begin circling before our descent to Shambhala International Airport at an undisclosed location. somewhere high in the Himalayas or possibly Himalayan mountains. I would appreciate anyone that wants to correct me. Please do so in the comments, whatever platform you happen to be listening to us on. I do thank everyone that has actually stuck with us this far. We hope that you will like and subscribe. Before we go, I would like us to share our socials. Roger, why don't you start us off? Tell people how they can contact Roger Hansen.
If you need to contact me, you can contact me at minds.com as Roger_Hansen. You can also find this show on Strange Stories on minds.com. It's the Strange Stories group. We've also got Strange Stories on YouTube. If you want to, you can also find us on The Wonderful World of Weirdness on YouTube and on Rumble. Other than that, you can find us on Kick, Twitch, and other platforms under my real name, which is Roger Hansen. I'm also on Teams with my community, Rogers Hangout, and Element Matrix at Rogers Hangout. And on X, I am Roger Hansen at ROGLOL1973. That's all I got.
Excellent. Thank you.
Right.
Oh, yeah. Well, you got to socializing. And of course, you need to contact Roger. Everyone needs to contact Roger at one point or another in their life. There's only contact. Well, there's some things you shouldn't contact Roger, but all the other things move on. And for me, well, you can check out my website at navakavada.org. That's NAVAKAVADA. It's spelled just like it sounds. Also on minds.com, AutoX. And yeah, I'm also at Rogers Hangout on Teams. Or you can reach me by Messenger Pigeon. Or maybe you'll run into me down at the corner. You never know. All right, we're making our final descent here towards Shambhala International Airport. Thanks, everyone, for flying Clandestine International Airlines. We hope to see you next week. Have a great time, everybody. Good night. Thank you.